At 7:42 on the morning of March 14, 1941, Beatrice Shilling stood on the tarmac at RAF Kenley watching a hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit for what might be his last mission. 32 years old, 6 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, zero solutions to the problem that was killing her pilots. The Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messmid Bf 109 fighters across the channel that week. RAF pilots had engaged them in 27 separate dogfights. 14 Hurricanes had
gone down.
9 Spitfires. The pattern was always the same. British pilot spots. German fighter. British pilot pushes into a dive to attack. Engine cuts out. German fighter escapes. Or worse, German fighter circles back and puts bullets through the stalled Hurricane while the pilot fights desperately to restart his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Shilling had seen the combat reports. She'd read the maintenance logs. She'd interviewed pilots who'd survived the engine failures. The carburetor flooded during -G maneuvers. Simple physics. Brutal consequences. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pushed into a sudden dive, fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The jet starved. The engine died for 1.5 seconds. 1.5 seconds was enough time for a Messerschmitt to close 300 YD and open fire. The Germans didn't have this problem. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. No float chamber, no flooding. Bf 109. Pilots could dive, climb, roll, invert their aircraft without losing power for a single heartbeat. It gave them a decisive advantage in every engagement. British pilots knew it. German pilots exploited it. Squadron commanders reported it. And the Royal Air Force was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Shilling had spent 11 months working on the problem. The engineering teams at Rolls-Royce were designing a pressure carburetor, a proper solution, a complete redesign of the fuel delivery
system.
But the pressure carburetor wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe 1944. The war wouldn't wait. The pilots couldn't wait. Every morning, young men climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing their own engines might kill them before the Germans got the chance. Squadron leader Davies walked past, Shilling toward the Hurricane. 24 years old, 41 combat missions, 3 confirmed
kills.
He'd reported engine failure twice in the past month. Both times during combat dives. Both times he'd survived by pure luck and 3,000 hours of training. He nodded at Shilling.
She
nodded back. He didn't know she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough.
He
probably thought she was someone's secretary. If you want to see how Shilling's breakthrough saved RAF pilots, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Shilling. She'd brought something with her to Kenley that morning. A small brass component, precisely machined, simple beyond belief. Her team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had tested it on a bench engine for 6 weeks. It worked. But bench tests weren't combat. Combat was 300 miles per hour. Combat was negative G-forces strong, enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat was life or death in 1.5 seconds. Shilling walked to her Norton motorcycle. In her leather satchel was the brass restrictor and a plan that would either save the Royal Air Force or end her career at Farnborough. By noon, she'd know which. The carburetor problem had started in July 1940. The Royal Air Force had switched to 100-octane fuel. Higher octane meant more boost. More boost meant 10 horsepower from the Merlin engine instead of 1100. The Spitfire Mark II could hit 370 miles per hour in level flight fast enough to catch measurement 109s. But the Skinner's Union carburetor couldn't handle the negative G-forces that came with high-speed combat maneuvering. Shilling understood carburetors better than anyone at Farnborough. She joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, 1 month after war was declared. She was one of 2 women in the engine department. The other woman was a secretary. Shilling was principal technical officer in charge of carburetor research and development. Most of the men she worked with had never met a female engineer. Some of them didn't believe women belonged in engineering. Shilling didn't care what they believed. She cared about keeping pilots alive. She'd grown up taking apart engines. At 14, she'd bought her first motorcycle, a Norton. She'd stripped the two-stroke engine down to individual components, learned how every part worked, then rebuilt it. At 25, she'd raced that Norton at Brooklyn's 106 miles per hour average speed, fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star. Only 3 women in history had earned that award. Shilling was the second. Racing had taught her how engines failed under stress. High turns, sudden acceleration, extreme lean angles.
She'd
learned to feel what an engine needed before the gauges told her. That intuition had made her the best carburetor specialist in Britain. And now British pilots were dying because their carburetors couldn't handle combat stress. The solution had come to her in January.
Simple physics.
The flow chamber flooding happened because fuel could flow unrestricted when gravity reversed. What if you restricted the flow? Not completely, just enough to prevent flooding. The engine would still get fuel, just not too much fuel. A brass disc with a precisely calculated hole in the center. Install it in the fuel line before the carburetor. Limit maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine demanded at full throttle. She'd machined the first restrictor herself. Brass thimble shape .125 in diameter. The hole in the center was 0.04 inches. Those dimensions mattered. Too large, and the carburetor would still flood. Too small, and the engine would starve at full power. She'd tested 17 different sizes before finding the right one. Then she'd simplified the design.
A
flat washer was easier to manufacture, easier to install, easier to replace if damaged. Bench tests showed it worked. The restrictor prevented flooding during simulated negative G conditions. But bench tests weren't combat.
She
needed to test it on an actual aircraft under actual combat conditions. The problem was getting permission. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters violated about 40 different regulations. If the restrictor failed in combat and a pilot died, Shilling would be court-martialed, maybe imprisoned. She decided to skip permission and ask forgiveness later. That morning at Kenley, she had 6 restrictors in her satchel and one very cooperative ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years. He'd seen 19 pilots die from engine failures. He didn't ask questions when Shilling showed him the brass washer. He just nodded and reached for his toolkit. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad. Pilot inside. Engine warming up. 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked fast. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and carburetor. The restrictor slid into
place.
He welded it with a small butane torch. 60 seconds of work.
The
modification was invisible unless you knew where to look. Shilling checked the weld. Clean, solid, professional. Squadron leader Davies would fly with the restrictor. He didn't know it was there. Shilling hadn't told him, hadn't told the squadron commander, hadn't told anyone except Cooper. If the restrictor failed and Davies died, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing documentation, just a dead pilot and a brass washer that shouldn't have been there.
The
Hurricane's Merlin engine roared to full power. Davies ran through pre-flight checks. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature good, magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. He released the brakes. The Hurricane rolled forward, gathered speed, lifted off. Shilling watched it
climb.
800 feet, 1,200 feet, 2,000 feet. The Hurricane banked south toward the channel. She'd brought a pair of binoculars. She watched Davies climb to 15,000 feet. 2 more Hurricanes joined him, a section of 3, standard patrol formation. They flew toward Dungeness. German fighters had been active over Dungeness all week. If Davies encountered a measurement, he'd have to dive, and the restrictor would either work or it wouldn't. Shilling waited on the tarmac. Cooper stood next to her. Neither of them spoke. Ground crew prepared 2 more Hurricanes for the afternoon patrol. A fuel truck rumbled.
Past.
Mechanics shouted technical jargon across the dispersal area. Normal sounds of a fighter station at war.
Shilling
Heard none of it. She was calculating fuel flow rates in her head. 4 inches. Maximum flow at full throttle. Negative G duration, 1.5 seconds. The math worked, but math wasn't combat. 40 minutes passed. An hour. Radio silence from